Alright, in this video I'll go over the book The Conquest for Bread by Peter Kropotkin. I'll go over what it is about and give you my honest opinion on it. So let's begin. But before that, let's first go over who the author is. Peter Kropotkin, born 1842 and died in 1921, was originally a military officer that came from a noble lineage and was actually a prince. Very interesting. He was very well disciplined at home, whilst his career was average. He met his wife through his work, and the two would end up having children. He would later become an anarcho-communist and began to write about his political views. So, from the first chapter, he starts off by saying that the human race has came a long way from inventing weapons, hunting, exploring nature, and so on. He tells us that without mutual aid, we wouldn't have the uprightness, as he says, and we would be species that would end up perishing. He goes on how the sermons in church go over giving to the poor, and he's trying to tell how religious people have hypocrisy, by the way. And, quote, "Fine sermons have been preached on the text that those who have should share with those who have not." But he would carry out this principle would be speedily informed that these beautiful sentiments are all very well in poetry, but not in practice. To lie is to degrade and to besmirch oneself, we say, and yet all civilized life becomes one huge lie. We accustom ourselves and our children of hypocrisy. And I must say, as a Christian myself, this is truly an issue with these other so-called Christians who claim to care about community but really give nothing back. This is common amongst, I guess, organized religions, and something we really shouldn't be surprised of, especially as Marxists. You really shouldn't be surprised with the hypocrisy of religious affiliation and of the church as well. And of course, as well, Peter is telling us about the hypocrisy of the people that are, of course, upper class, and as I said before, claim to be Christian, who do little to nothing about helping the poor. We see this today mostly on televangelists, Fox News people, and other types as well. Nothing has changed, sadly, as we see churches that cost millions of dollars to build, and yet they barely give anything back. Now, I'm going to move on to the third chapter. He goes over on what Anarcho-Communism is. Now, as on page 33, he says this: "Such is the method of the great industrial companies, the learned societies, and numerous associations of every description, which already cover Europe and the United States. And such will be the method of a free society based on the wage system and the exploitation of the masses by the capitalist finds its political expression in parliamentarism. But a free society, regaining possession of the common inheritance, must seek in free groups and free federations of groups of a new organization. In harmony with the new economic phase of history, every economic phase has a political phase corresponding to it, and it would be impossible to touch private property unless a new mode of political life will be found at the same time." This, of course, is no surprise. Usually any form of economic system, such as capitalism, socialism, fascism, and all that, need a form of a political group to survive. Like a certain state. That's how it can reach its goals. He goes on to say that without it, people can have a free society. However, he does not tell us how to do it or what to do it. He only says what is to be in said society when it happens. But again, how can it happen? How can we achieve this? How can we do it? Sadly, this part is not explained. Okay, moving on to the first part of chapter 4 on page 34. Peter quotes one of the Rothschild's reactions to the Revolution of 1848 by saying, in quote, "I am quite willing to admit that my fortune has been accumulated at the expense of others. But if it were divided tomorrow among the millions of Europe, the share of each would only amount to 4 shillings. Very well then, I undertake to render to each his 4 shillings if he asks me for it." Again, this was a quote from the Rothschilds, and this was on page 34, chapter 4. Of course, this shows how much the capitalists of the upper class give little to no shits about the worker or the people under them. They only care for the profit. They don't care whether the worker gets killed or dies. They know they can be replaced, and they know they can make more money off of them. And after this, Peter makes up made a hypothetical quote asking, then how do you suggest we prevent them, the Rothschilds of course, coming in from the outside, sitting among the masses of the lackeys and the wage slaves? And as I try to look back in the book, I can find no answer he gives to this, but instead he goes on to another made-up question, basically asking how would anarchists go at having a revolution as well as have some form of a police force in order to keep, order, make money, as well as establish housing. This is the part where he compares anarcho-communes to the Middle Ages, saying that the peasants never had enough barren soil to farm. He says if the peasants of his time, which would be the late 1800s, lived rent and tax free whilst having the proper tools in order to survive. However, there are people that are affected by pestilence, famine, and other horrors of nature. Thus, the peasants will always try to better their existence. Near the end of the chapter, he goes over industry, and he says they, and I'm assuming proprietors, abolish master manufacturers, but however, they leave the landlord to own the land and the banker to own their money. And he says they will maintain these idlers who are just middlemen of the state and numberless officials. And he goes on to say that the peasants will still remain poor. The manufacturing industries that are spread over the world, the manufacturers would be unable to stay, and thousands of workers would end up being out of work. However, the next part I found interesting was in chapter 5, pages 56 through 57. He references the scientific theorist, and I think he most likely means scientific socialism, which is what Friedrich Engels wrote about, and so did Karl Marx at one point, saying that the theorists do not trust themselves in the so-called Dark Council and, I quote, expound their muddle-headed theories as much as they like, provided they have no authority. This is, of course, a reference to the idea of state socialism, where there's a dictatorship over the proletariat to suppress the oppressing class, as well as other oppressing forces, which he thinks will go corrupt and has a right, and he does have a right to worry, but the socialist state serves a purpose in order to transition from capitalism to communism. Of course, he might not understand the idea of materialism. For those who don't know, the idea of materialism is that the material conditions affect our outcomes and situations of society. They affect the way we think, the way we act, and the way we form as people. Usually anarchists and fascists tend not to understand this, even though it is basic science that deals with biology and all sorts, and also with reality. This is somewhat ironic, however, because in chapter 9 on page 102, he mentions that, quote, leathers and science will take their proper place in the work of human development when freed from all mercenary bondage. They will be exclusively cultivated by those who love them, and for those who love them. If that is so, then why ignore or deny scientific theory of socialism to have a state? However, we must keep in mind at this time there is no real example of anarchy or state socialism. Even though the Paris Commune is debatable, I think it's more anarchy. But however, it was said that by Marx and Lenin that the Paris Commune was an example of the dictatorship of the proletariat. This is a process, of course, state socialism, again, as I said before, is a process to stateless communism. Anyway, he goes on again about the so-called state-loving socialists in the 11th chapter. He starts by asking the reader how often do they read the works of state-loving socialists about regulating certain things like canal traffic, and wondering if the state lover ever thinks that the anarchist never thought of it. The issue is the anarchist's answer is usually romantic. Peter's answer is that, for instance, certain communes or even groups will want to make their barges pass before others. But who would regulate this, though? There is need for a state to help keep things on track, to help people get involved with the way of doing things, to help a society remain stable. So when the time comes for we no longer need a state, we would have the knowledge necessary to know how to live communally. On pages 127 to 128, he has examples about an English Lifeboat Association and how ships crash every year and how the help of the people, not the government, to set the issue straight. However, the case is that people learn this from unity and helping each other is still evident through the state. The lack of help could be an example of poor organization, which can be fixed mainly under a new system and if you gain the right people. In chapter 12, he goes over the objections against communism. On page 133, Peter says that it is not them, he means anarchists, to answer the objection to quote-unquote authoritarian communists, which is an oxymoron. He says if an authoritarian socialist society were to ever be able to establish itself, in which case it did, he did get to see one, which would be the Soviet Union, where he died. It wouldn't last. This is ironic since anarcho-communist societies never lasted long either. The Free Territory of Ukraine lasted 3 years and it was known as a land pirate group. Catalonia also lasted 3 years until succumbing to the fascists under Franco, while socialist governments tend to last for years. However, if I am correct, the only short-lived one was in Africa, a country by the name of Burkina Faso, when socialist leader Thomas Sankara was betrayed by his friend. But however, it is a fun fact to know that most former socialist countries would like to have that form of government again. Russia is a great example. Not only is Stalin a very popular leader still amongst Russians, but the Communist Party is the second largest party. So does Romania. I know a Romanian who lives in Romania, and he says many people miss Nicolae Ceausescu, and they miss his form of government. They miss socialism. They want it back. In the eastern half of Germany has voted left for a long time, ever since the fall in '89, and most of them would like to go back under Eric. And it's just something that media doesn't like to mention because they don't want people to gain the influence, and most upperclassmen don't want to lose their money to the workers. However, this shows that the quote-unquote authoritarian society actually worked on improving lives of the people. No one wants anarchy, and there's very few examples of people wanting to be a libertarian socialist because there are such few examples of it working, as well as not a state to snuff out the counter-revolutionaries and reactionaries. He proceeds to say that in anarcho-communist society, the society will recognize the freedom of the individual. And I am sure that it will recognize the freedom of the individual, but however, I believe that we should limit those freedoms to an extent until, people learn how to share communally. Hence why I believe in state socialism and certain limited rights for a while until we can get to full communism. Because humans were meant to live in a collective force and helping each other out, not killing each other for the sake of killing. We are animals that must survive. We are born to survive, not hurt each other. It's not natural for us. And hence why we again need state socialism in order to help us psychologically learn how to live with each other communally, because it all deals with the material conditions surrounding us. Okay, so on chapter 13, Peter goes over the collectivist wage system. He says that the ones that want to get rid of the capitalist system, the people who want to return to the state, he most likely is referring to the Marxists, in the wage system. This, of course, is false. We do not want a wage system. Marxists want a meritocracy, where the work put in, they receive the fruit of their labor. His lack of understanding of this is a serious fault. Next, he goes over on to the workers' day under the state and how it is fixed, how the land is owned by the state, how they are paid by checks and how much they worked, and they use them to pay for food, which is the aim we are going for. The goal of communism is the abolition of money, of course, to help end separation of class. Some countries do this, such as Cuba. Cuba now passes out rational cards because they're trying to help abolish the money system, and how much they work, they put in, they can spend those ration cards for items such as food and housing and liquor. Alright, next he rants on how the Marxist states claim to be anti-private property, yet want to nationalize the means of production. This is needed in order to help us transfer to capitalism to communism. In communism, there is no private property and no nationalization. However, in socialism, there is nationalization, and the government is run by the workers, not by the capitalists. As I said before, it is needed to state socialism is needed to transfer from capitalism to communism. In chapter 16, on pages 186 to 187, Peter goes to say that it is foolish to export wheat and then import flour, and etc., basically like a hat on a hat. He says if they do not trade properly, they will remain underdeveloped. He is not wrong on that notion. But in order to have a good trading process, we need an organ of people to help sort it out. You need educated people to work on this in order to have a successful country. In chapter 17, he goes over agriculture, and the part that I have highlighted on page 195, he says that taxes make it hard for the worker to gain the fruits of their labor. And this is mainly going over private property and not authoritarian socialism. He doesn't mean authoritarian socialism right now. He's talking about capitalist private property, saying how the landlords need to go, and which they do, since they tend to tax the tenant from the land they're living on, which they can go corrupt, and because the tenant may not make enough, they may not have enough money, and so on. And this is one of the reasons why we're against private property, because human beings should own the land. Human beings together should own the land, not just one sole person. He also goes over banks and how they keep their money, and I can say that I believe in nationalizing the banks, because I don't want the banks to be private and they go AWOL from the state. They end up going corrupt. They need to be monitored by the state in order to be successful. Okay, on chapter 17, he goes over, and on page 205, the book brings up culture. The quote is, "The result of all these recent conquests of culture is that the one half only of the adults of a city give each about 50 half days for the culture of the finest fruits and vegetables out of the season. They would have all year round an unlimited supply of that sort of fruit and vegetables for the whole population." And this is something that all communists strive for. Contrary to right-wing popular belief, communists believe in striving for better working hours so we can have time for our will, so we can make art and come up with new ideas in order to promote a healthy culture for the libertarian. Right-wingers say that we are against culture, they want to destroy it, and all this cultural Marxism bullshit, which cultural Marxism isn't really a thing. It was made up by a capitalist who is very anti-Jewish. But the truth is, Marxists want culture. We just don't want old culture due to the fact that it holds us back. We want to progress to a newer, healthier culture that promotes equality amongst men and women, better working hours. Feel free to express ways through music, art, and literature, because, again, contrary to popular belief, Marxists love art. It is said that the Soviet Union had such lovely movies. Even filmmakers such as George Lucas, who is known for Star Wars and Indiana Jones, said he could wish he could film in the Union because as long as they didn't critique the government too harshly, they could make whatever they want. And it wasn't in the name of profit, but in the name of art. And I'll repeat this again. Contrary to right-wing belief, communists believe in art and we believe in culture. Anyway, at the end of the chapter on page 212, he paints this romanticized picture of what life will be after the state will be abolished under Anarcho-Communism. Okay, now my thoughts on this book. Well, first, this is the first book I read that was related to anarchy. And I must say that as a communist, I am disappointed. And as a philosopher, I am, well, disappointed. This book is nothing more than a romanticized piece of literature that gives us no explanation on how to achieve this society. The critiques he gave against state socialism fell flat considering the examples we have seen during the Cold War era. But again, as I say before, he didn't really see that many socialist states in his time, except for one, which would have been the Union, which he would end up dying in 1921. This is the main issue I have with anarchy in general, to be honest. They lack theory as how to achieve their society. He does make a few good points, such as better working conditions and exploitative upper class and hypocrisy. However, those are few and far between, sadly. I do not regret reading this, but there are much better books out there. Anyway, I apologize for not being in on a while and making videos a while. I was distracted by other things. As for my next video, I will go over morality, and after that I will go over religion, which I think, now that I think about it, I might just put those two videos together, go over morality and religion, and then after that I may go over my thoughts on psychology. And after that I'll go over the book called The Symposium by Plato, which is one of my first Plato books I ever read, and I gotta say, is when I remember reading it, it's a very good book, but I'll save that for the review. And yeah, this is Bakora98, signing off.